Ubisoft is worth about 1.59 billion euro on the stock market, but their new subsidiary, announced last week, is valued at 4.3 billion euro, which is a little bit more, and you might be thinking, how can that possibly make sense? And the reason why is that Ubisoft leadership just sidestepped the stock market. It really is quite the story. So Ubisoft's managing and founding family, the Guillemets, just got reinforcements in the corporate war that they have been waging, and it's all thanks to their long-term ally Tencent. You see, we've been following this story since it first began last summer, and it involves the Guillemot brothers failing to defeat a hostile takeover of Gameloft in the early 2000s, and that leading to them not really wanting to be corporately screwed again. They then successfully defeated a hostile takeover attempt of Ubisoft in the late 2010s. Now, some people only think it is just now that Tencent has came onto the scene, but that is simply false, because Tencent have been involved for years. They actually increased their ownership stake to 49.9% of Guillemot Brothers. Guillemot Brothers is the company through which the Guillemots own Ubisoft, and their share in that went up as of 2022. And it's through that deal that basically they fended off the hostile takeover attempt from Vivendi. And that is what has set us up for today's story, because in a way, this is not new. This is, though, evolution, and it's evolution that has been driven by the environment. So following Shadows, Ubisoft signed a new deal, and it's a deal designed to withstand a challenge from activist investors who want to force the Guillemots out. And with this deal being made, the Guillemots' control over Ubisoft, in a way, is far stronger. But it has came at a cost. Tencent do have some more control now, and the rest of Ubisoft may well suffer. Let's get into all of the details. So the launch of Assassin's Creed Shadows likely put a final number in the deal, but obviously a deal like this does not just happen over a few days. Ubisoft and Tencent started talking about this stuff as far back as last October, right? So within the span of about 5 weeks, at that time, Ubisoft had seen the lackluster launch of Outlaws. They had a, let's just say, aggressive, manipulative open letter from AJ Investments, and then the delay of Assassin's Creed Shadows to February. Now that was well before the January stock update, where the company asked advisors to, quote, pursue various transformational, strategic, and capitalistic options to extract the best value for shareholders, which, is kind of what all of this stuff is. Now, that was all part of the same plan, the plan being to keep the shareholders happy, to give them signs of progress being made. And in that instance, the sign was, of course, studio closures and layoffs. But all the while, they were working with Tencent to find a solution that keeps Ubisoft running. Now, previously, last week's video, actually before any of this went public, we reported that there were rumors of an Ubisoft Split coming, where some intellectual property would be siloed off, basically to make Ubisoft more efficient. Fun corporate shenanigans that I'll get into. As it turns out, those rumors were true, but the framing was not true, because this is not an independent company. This is something that is happening within Ubisoft. Okay, so here's how the deal is working. Tencent are investing 1.16 billion euro, but not in Ubisoft as a whole. They're actually not buying stock. They're not allowed to because of corporate agreements that exist. So instead, that money is an investment. It's an investment in a new subsidiary that's currently unnamed, but for the sake of today, I'm just going to call it Ubisoft 2, right? So Ubisoft 1 is the Ubisoft that we know. Ubisoft 2 is the new company. And here's how things are going to work between the two companies, right? So Ubisoft plans to license the brands of Assassin's Creed, Far Cry, and Rainbow Six to Ubisoft 2. Ubisoft 2 will also control the studios that make those games, plus the back catalogs and any games that are in development. Now, they're not being fully isolated from the rest of Ubisoft, right? And like the operating structure, the final form of things is still to be confirmed, and the deal's probably not going to close until the end of this year, but we do know that the new company will still be controlled by Ubisoft. Now, Tencent will likely have a seat, but, Ubisoft themselves are saying that they still are in control. Now, this new company, Ubisoft 2, also won't hold any of their own technology. That's kind of interesting because it means the Anvil engine, which is what powers Assassin's Creed Shadows, and essentially their entire Assassin's Creed game pipeline, which is fairly large, that is still going to be owned by Ubisoft 1. And there's seemingly nothing to stop the Ubisoft 2 studios from collaborating with Ubisoft 1 studios. which does seem a bit weird, or even letting the Ubisoft One studios work in games from the franchises that are now going to be controlled by Ubisoft Two. But what is a bit different is that Ubisoft Two has been sliced off and will basically have its own mission. So the board of Ubisoft Two have a remit to focus on this, and this is a quote, on enhancing creative vision and streamlining operations with the authority to make swift, high-impact decisions across development, marketing, and distribution. Oh boy, that does sound like a kind of mission statement designed to make investors feel really, really happy. Who doesn't like a swift, high-impact decision? So to basically translate, the whole point is that Ubisoft 2 can work in these franchises without having to worry about the rest of Ubisoft 1 really having input or control, sludge that could slow the whole thing down. So in theory, what they're doing is they're adding another layer of management to speed up Ubisoft's decision process. And generally, the more management you have, the slower all that shit gets. It seems the point, though, is that this is more management, but it is sliced off with its own mission, and the others don't really have as much impact or control over them. It really is quite something. Although that being said, it's not like Ubisoft 2 can go completely wild because the Ubisoft board would still have to have final say-off over things. But what about Tencent? Well, Tencent gets to have 25% ownership of Ubisoft 2. Now, in a way, you could look at that and think 1.16 billion euro, that's a lot of money for only a quarter of 3 game franchises. Well, you could say it's a lot of money, but that entirely depends on how much they can make. Back in 2022, Ubisoft announced the plan to have 2 billion euro in annual revenues from just 3 franchises: Assassin's Creed, Far Cry, and Tom Clancy as a whole. Now, that last part has been shaved down to just being Rainbow Six as a part of this deal, and it does make sense. Those are Ubisoft's big money makers, right? I mean, we just went through a long-term plan for what they call Period 3 of Assassin's Creed in our last video. The TLDR? There will be many, many, many video games. Then, of course, Rainbow Six Siege. Well, it just went free to play and it started to rebuild itself for the next 10 years. And then Far Cry is weird because it still is a massive game franchise, right? They had 10 million sales, I think over 10 million sales, in a single year for Far Cry 6, which is kind of insane. That's a lot of sales. And while Far Cry has become so samey that it seems they're rethinking things a little bit, it obviously can go the distance. So, going forward then, 75% of that revenue will go to Ubisoft. 25% of that revenue will go to Tencent. Now let's just say that 2 billion is real. Well, for Tencent, that is a cool $500 million a year, meaning that they would hit return on investment after only 3 years. Now sure makes it seem like the deal of the century, but remember, Ubisoft 2 is technically licensing these brands from Ubisoft 1, so there may be a fee for that, or of course Ubisoft could do accounting trickery. Let's be real, if you can do accounting trickery, you almost certainly will. Now in the immediate term, right, Ubisoft 1 gets to reinvest the 1.16 billion euro in taking a whole big chunk out of their 2 billion in debt, so that's probably quite nice, and with that they can fund development of games just at the wider Ubisoft 1 company. But of course, the real value here, right? The real value is in the corporate shenanigans created by Ubisoft 2's existence. And that's because there are various protections built into this deal. Protections like Ubisoft not being able to sell their majority stake in the subsidiary for 2 years. Tencent, by the way, won't be able to sell for 5 years, and Tencent gets first right of refusal on any further transfers and a bunch of other things. And the contract also gives Tencent minority shareholder interests over Ubisoft's biggest 3 franchises, which is fairly humongous. And those interests are protected by a license that is, quote, worldwide, exclusive, irrevocable, and perpetual. So it can't just be taken back by a new board. That really does lock in control in a fairly ironclad way. And that means that taking over Ubisoft just got much harder for the activist investors. Of course, that's AJ Investments, the people who we've been following since last year. And it also means that in an absolute crisis scenario of everything being sold off, Ubisoft knows that these brands cannot work with the rest of the company's tech, which means that in that case, they're effectively worthless. By circling the wagons around their most valuable assets, what it now means is the rest of Ubisoft feels pretty damn exposed. If you're not in one of those big 3 games that are real well protected, you're going to be worried. So let's think about those numbers from the start. If this new company is worth 4.3 billion and the old one is worth a third of that, what does that say? What does that imply about the value of everything else in Ubisoft? I've got to start this off with a quote that was given to Insider Gaming. Here it is. "We feel expletive if we're not on the big three." I imagine that expletive is fucked, and they're saying, we're fucked if we're not in the big three. That's apparently what a dev said, and it makes sense because there's a very simple read in this entire scenario. If you don't work in a game that is now owned by Ubisoft 2, in a way you don't matter, because Ubisoft 2 is literally the thing that's got the high value. And that means that people are very worried about being laid off, studios being closed, and intellectual property being sold. And management have not smoothed out those fears yet. Now, there's at least some degree of comfort to be drawn from the split. The Division and Ghost Recon being retained does suggest that Ubisoft leadership weren't willing to transfer all of their biggest brands to Ubisoft 2. So that does mean that they're still retaining some of the good live services that they've got, like For Honor and Brawlhalla, and it kind of suggests that they do have plans to, make revenue that doesn't involve Ubisoft 2. So that could be good, and the deal does in theory protect all of Ubisoft, so Ubisoft 1 and Ubisoft 2, from being sold off in a very short-term way to please the very hostile investors like AJ Investments. But what it's not is a guaranteed win. Ubisoft will immediately have quite the balance sheet problem. I mean, if 25% of the three biggest franchise revenues are going to Tencent, that's 25% less for the rest of the company. That could make the balance sheet look bad. That could mean more closures. It could mean layoffs as a result of all of this. So staff are not wrong to be worried here. And remember, it seems the Guillemets are principally concerned with keeping the company under their name, keeping it stable, and then making sure that the company remains whole. So ultimately, it comes down to the very same principle that we have been arguing for since this whole story started, that the biggest, most profitable, most valuable parts of Ubisoft are not the parts that make the good niche games, like Rayman or like Anno. The stock market does not care about those whatsoever, but now it looks to staff like Ubisoft management also don't really care about them as well. And that's going to mean people are scared. So the question is whether they can prove to staff that they are better than the investors that they're stopping. So let's review the threat that Ubisoft faces. So it's not eliminated by this deal. In some ways, this deal could make it a bit worse. As an example, the market reacted well to the news of this deal for about 5 hours. By Monday, the price was lower than before the announcement, which maybe doesn't look great. All those things to protect Ubisoft as a part of this deal also are things that make it a less desirable investment, right? So one of the things that AJ have been furious about, so they say, is minority shareholder stuff. Now, you got to remember, AJ Investments, whenever I say activist investors, I don't mean that in the way that you may think. Activist investors are the type who will jump in, try to affect very short-term change to jack up a stock price, and then they'll exit their position, having made a shitload of money. So essentially in this deal, we see moves made to insulate Ubisoft from the threat that they pose. But those changes do sort of make Ubisoft a bit of a worse investment. Now, we can then pair that with the perception that the company has got nothing to release in the next few years, and you can see how it looks like a bad state of affairs. Now, AJ Investments will likely go ahead with the protest that they said they would be planning in May. And that's not some online protest, no, they're going to Paris. They're going to Paris to protest at the head office. It's quite something. For Ubisoft as a whole, though, what this does do is it buys time. That means time to show off Assassin's Creed remasters, to say, hello world! Black Flag, remade in the Anvil engine. Please buy many copies, please. We really need the money. To maybe have a new Far Cry and other things. Basically, time to build a €2 billion a year backbone at Ubisoft 2 that they hope will be able to support Ubisoft 1. Now, the next big update will be May 14th, because that is when they'll host their full year earnings call. The expectation is that hitting quarterly revenue of €956 million will be attained, that their back catalogue will be buoyed by Assassin's Creed sales. But the question is, will that happen? And then whenever they show things off at the various summer showcases, will that be enough to stop investors wanting further cuts, further optimizations to costs to make the short-term balance sheet look better? So they've progressed through one very threatening stage. They're still under threat. And at the end of the day, they need to make good games that'll sell shitloads of copies. We still need to see if that'll happen. Okay, if you want more detail though on the AJ Investments angle, check out this video next. I think you'll love it if you found this interesting.